Hello, everybody. We're a couple of days after Christmas, and of course, on Christmas, if you're not Christian, especially if you're Jewish, the two things to do are eat Chinese food and go to the movies. I missed my Chinese meal, but I did go to the movies. And what else to see on Christmas than the new movie about Bob Dylan, a complete unknown? It's an interesting movie, to be kind to it, perhaps. And my guest today, Seth Rogovoy, is a distinguished cultural commentator. He's the author of a very well-received book on Bob Dylan. It's called Prophet, Mystic, Poet. Seth Rogovoy is based in the wonderful town of Hudson in upstate New York. And he wrote an interesting review of A Complete Unknown, which is entitled Why? Seth Rogovoy, happy Christmas from one Jew to another. Why this movie, Complete Unknown? You weren't, I think it would be fair to say, you weren't, like myself, particularly impressed with the movie.
No, I wasn't. And, I went into it skeptical because, well, I had seen the trailers, which some people thought, oh, Timothy Chalamet is amazing. And I didn't feel that way based on the trailers. And also I got the sense from going into it that this was going to be a very conventional Hollywood biopic, as they say. Not treating his entire career, but treating an essential 4-year period from when he arrived in New York City to when he exploded on the scene, and culminating in the when he goes electric, as they say, at the Newport Folk Festival in 1965. So that's what they bit off. And like I say, I was skeptical going in, but I really said to myself, look, at least be open-minded. Think of it in terms of not what I was gonna feel so much, is try to see it through the eyes of the average moviegoer. That was my assignment to myself. And I tried, but unfortunately, given what the material that I saw and what I had to work with, it was even worse than what I thought it was going to be. And it's not so much the fact that almost everything which appeared to be based on some kind of reality was fictionalized, was made up. Scenes, people weren't, Joan Baez didn't live in New York City, which they show her as leaving her apartment and walking down the block, and all of a sudden seeing Dylan, a young, fresh Dylan in a folk club. That never happened. But I don't want to quibble with, I understand the need to streamline and to do composites of actual scenes or composites of characters. But I didn't understand to what effect they were doing so much of this, because, again, trying to see it through the eyes of just the average moviegoer, I found there was no narrative arc to the story. I mean, if you describe what happened, what it tries to portray, yeah, there's an arc. He becomes famous and more famous, and he's a folk singer, then a political protest singer, and then, of course, he goes electric. I say that in quotes because, when Dylan's first single release in 1962 was actually an electric rock song that everybody has conveniently forgotten. It was called Mixed Up Confusion, and it was a delectable little gem, especially if you go back and listen to it and think about the timing of it. But in any case, what even mystified me more than anything, especially because the advance word and the advanced press hype, and then the advance reports from people who had, in whatever way, seen early screenings of the film before the official opening this past Christmas, people just talked about how amazing Timothy Chalamet was. And I have nothing against the guy. I don't really know his work that well. I haven't seen the Dune films or Wonka. Um, but I'm mystified by the worshipful response to his performance, because just as a performance, forget even about does he capture Dylan, although we will, I don't think he does. You know, one thing I'll give him is that he did all his own singing and guitar playing, and I thought he did that reasonably well. And it was not a total imitation of Dylan, but it was a decent facsimile of what Dylan sounded like. But what really mystified me is, we have so many resources, documentary films, interviews, bootleg tapes of what Dylan was like at that time, including the complete performances from the Newport Folk Festival, which were gathered in a wonderful documentary about, I guess, 15 years ago called The Other Side of the Mirror, which simply just shows you his performances 63, 64, 65, the same period of time that this new movie covers. And what you see in the original footage of Dylan is you're just amazed and blown away by his intensity, by his sense of humor, by his antic personality. And none of that at all is reflected in A Complete Unknown or in Timothy Chalamet's one-note performance. I was just struck by how from beginning to end, you meet him and he's got this kind of heavy-lidded look to himself, and it's like he has no affect the entire
Right.
time.
I agree. So, Seth, I agree with you in the film. Although my critique is that there were two or three competing narratives, none of which did a particularly good job. There was the politics narrative, the Cuban Missile, anti-Vietnam, folk music narrative. There was the love narrative of his involvement, or perhaps lack of involvement, with the two dominant women in the film. One, a mythological version of an early girlfriend, the other, of course, with Joan Baez. But the movie never made up its mind what it was about. It never made up its mind whether it was about Bob Dylan as a romantic figure who fell in love with lots of girls, a film, as you say, about the early 60s and the changes in America. So it failed on many fronts. This idea of A Complete Unknown, it's a wonderful title for a film. It seems the biggest criticism, my view at least, of the film is that Dylan didn't even seem, and as you suggested, he was a much more interesting figure in real life than he was in the movie, but he didn't seem to have any grasp of himself. There was no attempt to even make sense of the inner Bob Dylan, if there was indeed one or is one. Is that fair?
Absolutely. I agree 100% with everything you just said. And it was very frustrating. Now, granted, it's not easy in any, whether it's a biopic or whether it's a feature film, to capture the inner workings of a creative mind in cinema. Is not an easy task, but that's not to say that it can't be done. And I think it has been done before with Bob Dylan as the subject, and that was the Todd Haynes film, I'm Not There.
Yeah, 2007 movie, which is a much more ambitious film. And to deal with Dylan, you've got to be ambitious, given the ambitious nature of him and his art.
Exactly. And you need to somehow reach him on, attempt to render him and reach him on his own terms, which is what I'm Not There does. You have 6 different actors and actresses playing Dylan. in of all different ages and all different colors. Um, so the film itself, I'm Not There, I'm speaking about, is very Dylan-esque. It's very much like a Bob Dylan song or many Bob Dylan songs. It's with a clear experimental point of view. So to try to then take the story of Bob Dylan, which, as you pointed out, there's so much complexity because there's the greater context, there's the personal stuff, there's obviously the songs, and there's what happened when he did burst on the scene and then go electric, and really the revolution in the wake of his going electric. um you're just you're left with, there's no point of view in this film. It just has scenes that aren't well written, don't particularly reveal character, not only Dylan's character, but even the other people's character. And so, like I wrote in my review, I went in wondering why. Why make this? Why try to make a conventional film about an unconventional genius? And I left without any of the answers to any of those questions.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I came out, I have to admit, equally mystified. I mean, maybe I know, or you certainly know too much for these kinds of film, but I went in also with your attitude thinking it'll probably be a mainstream biopic, but I'll enjoy it. And I came out, and I'm usually not frustrated with films because I usually go in with an open mind and I find stuff that I like and accept it. But with this one, it was just completely beyond the pale, so to speak. I wonder whether it speaks, Seth, of our broader cultural situation. We had another music journalist on the show a couple of weeks ago, David Rowell. I'm sure you know his work. His new book, The Endless Refrain, Memory, Nostalgia, and the Threat to New Music, suggests that there is a hostility to new music, that old music has become the elevator soundtrack of our lives, and that we're incapable of dealing with new music. And then we also had Jonathan Taplin, an old friend of mine, on the show. He was Dylan's tour manager in the 60s. He has a similar take on how culture has essentially gone to sleep in the last 50 years. I wonder what the film, and the fact that it seems to be well received and perhaps will even do well, what it tells us more broadly about memory, or the lack of memory, and a figure like Dylan who really towers over the last 60 years of American cultural and musical history.
Right. Well, it's a great question. It's a big question. And, in order to address it, you really have to make broad generalizations, which
Well, you're allowed to on this show. That's the nature.
Okay. Well, yeah, it ain't like it. I don't want to sound like a cranky old man,
Like me.
who just thinks things were better back then and it's all gone to hell in a handbasket. Even though, if I think to a large extent it has, but let's look at it this way. One thing that we clearly, a huge change which we don't think so much about. I mean, maybe you and I do, and your astute viewers do think about this, but I don't think that it's part of the general cultural conversation, is that there is no kind of cultural consensus, and or at least there doesn't have to be a consensus, but there needs to be some kind of common ground, so at least we can talk about stuff using the same language and the same facts. So, for example, in the 60s, I mean, obviously the Beatles were enormous, unprecedented. The world loved the Beatles. Now, were there some people who didn't like them? Of course. But they were hugely popular, and you could talk about then all the other music in context with the Beatles and with Bob Dylan, because even the Beatles themselves, when they started listening to Dylan, the Beatles totally did a 180-degree turn in the kinds of songs that they wrote and sang. And vice versa. The Beatles, and you wouldn't know this from a complete unknown, but Dylan was very impressed and taken with the Beatles when he first heard them, because it turned out that they were all very influenced by the same music. The Beatles, worshipped Buddy Holly and Chuck Berry and Little Richard, and so did Bob Dylan when he was a teenager in Hibbing, Minnesota. He had several bands which basically specialized. He was the leader, and he banged on the piano and sang Little Richard songs. I mean, there's even recordings of this that still
So are
exist.
you about to blame, like so many others, I know Taplin has strong feelings on this, the internet? Is it the fragmentation of culture? Now there's a billion channels as opposed to a single one where everyone listens to the Beatles or the Rolling Stones or Bob Dylan?
Yes. Although I qualify that because, in theory at least, the democratization of the accessibility of all this music should be a good thing, but we lose something, and it's not like we still we aren't given certain people to rally around in a similar way. For most obviously Taylor Swift, who you can't get away from for the past however many years. Then you get into a whole conversation as to what does Taylor Swift's popularity.
So I take your point. So is a complete unknown, which presumably they spend a lot of money on it. They'll spend a lot of money on advertising. It will get seen a lot. Chalamet will certainly get an Oscar nomination, may even win the Oscar.
Right.
For the people who know nothing about Dylan, who see this film, is this just endless refrain? Is this the 60s being turned into elevator music and Dylan being turned into an elevator figure?
Sure. Absolutely. They really denuded him of any kind of controversial content. Now, obviously there's some controversy. I mean, the way, but even when they demonstrate the controversy, like when he went electric at Newport, they play it, they totally exaggerate it. They what I think back on is that scene in I'm Not There portraying the same thing, Dylan going electric. Kate Blanchett plays that era of Bob Dylan and is brilliant. And Dylan and his band,
I'm Not There.
I'm Not There.
In
Yes.
the Todd Haynes movie.
So in the scene in that movie where he goes electric at Newport, they have the band striking up the music, and then all of a sudden they all pull out machine guns and gun down the audience, which is obviously a metaphor. I mean, I'm not saying that really happened, but there's more truth to that than what we're shown.
I mean, the thing that, and you've written, and I want to get to your new book on George Harrison in a minute, because there's a clear bridge between Dylan and Harrison. You've written 2 books, one on Dylan, one on Harrison. But the thing that I don't know the answer, I have no idea, is how someone as young and inexperienced as Dylan could produce not just 1 or 2 or 5 or 10, but 50 songs of such lasting significance. I mean, there's a Shakespearean quality. And the more you know about the guy, he seemed in some ways, I know your book is on him as a prophet, a mystic, a poet. But when you watch him, he seems a very ordinary kind of guy. It's such a mystery to understand how a kid could produce such monumental art. And then the movie doesn't even make an attempt to explain it, let alone explain it.
Right. Which is mystifying, because isn't that the question that you have to deal with?
Yeah, I mean,
Isn't
it's a
that
Shakespeare question
yeah,
of how could a single individual, and with Shakespeare, we're so mystified that we eventually suggest that there were more than one Shakespeare. No one's ever argued that. I mean, I guess in a sense he stole his songs, but no one's ever argued there's more than one Bob Dylan. That he actually wrote these songs that defined
mhm,
an entire era.
right, right. Yes, and invented an entirely new way of songwriting, regardless of whether he played it on acoustic guitar or electric guitar. He had that electric period, but, then he did brilliant acoustic albums like Blood on the Tracks
Yeah, I know
years
you're
later.
a big fan. That's my favorite album of all time, and that's the other astonishing thing about Dylan. And the movie doesn't even make an attempt to address that. Is this was just the beginning.
Right, right.
Um, I mean, even his last album is astonishing. So yeah. Anyway, um, enough reasons for people not to see the film. Um, if you, as I said, Bob Dylan, prophet, mystic, poet. Before we get to your Harrison book, Seth, what's your? I mean, there are many books on Dylan. Many very distinguished writers, journalists have thought, filmmakers have thought about the guy. What are you saying that other people haven't said?
In my book.
Yeah, and in
Yes.
your take on Dylan, what's
Yeah.
the Rogovoy take that adds to the corpus on him?
Well, certainly in my book, what I was struck I mean, I was struck with many things, and, I've been a huge Dylan fan since I came of age as a teenager in the early 1970s, and then, went backwards and listened to all the old stuff, and then lived along with him throughout the '70s until today, seeing him countless times and memorizing all his songs and playing them on guitar and singing them at open mic nights. But, so, there's so many things about Dylan that I love. I even once taught a course about Dylan and film because he has an entire you could look at Dylan and his entire film career, both as an actor, director, screenwriter. But what really became my wheelhouse was over many, many years. Dylan was, it's as if I went to yeshiva, a Jewish uh, school to study the Bible and the Talmud. I didn't do any of this, but but it but I did it first with Bob Dylan. I mean, I read everything, and back in the early 1970s, you could read everything. There wasn't that much really written, and I studied the lyrics and talked about him with friends, and um, went to see him in concert countless times. And so that my comparison with a yeshiva student is that I came to know Dylan in and Dylan's scripture, meaning his lyrics, in a deep and profound way, and I could quote anything and everything from it. Then, in my adult life, in my 30s, late 30s, early 40s, I did actually on my own do a deep dive into Jewish and Hebrew scripture, the Bible, the Talmud, Kabbalah, other Jewish writings of philosophy and mysticism. And what struck me as I went through this material is I kept coming across images, phrases, scenes, which I knew from Bob Dylan's songs.
Right. So you turned Dylan into, shall we say, maybe turned him into Moses. You even have your top 10 Dylan Jewish songs, which include sort of fundamentalist Judaism of one kind or another. Do you think he was conscious, or was this just something that came out of him? I mean, the remarkable thing again about Dylan is that everyone can find something.
Yes.
It's as if you come to him as a Kabbalah student, somebody else comes as a leftist, somebody else comes perhaps even as an American nationalist or a nostalgist. It's as if everyone can find something.
Yes. I mean, one of his more recent songs that he wrote is I Contain Multitudes.
Yeah.
Obviously, referring back to Walt Whitman, but also very much that's so true. And I think that's utterly and totally valid that people can come to him from all of these points of view and find things there.
Do you think I mean, another song on that last album, My Own Version of You, I'm quoting it. He says, I'll take Scarface, Pacino, and the Godfather Brando, mix them up in a tank and get a robot commando. Was he always in the business of invention and reinvention? That seems to be the essence of him, both
Yes,
as a man and obviously as an artist. And he was always
absolutely.
moving. I mean, and I guess in a sense, if there's anything in A Complete Unknown that the movie does, it's to give some idea that he wasn't willing to stand still.
Hmm. Yes, entirely. Uh, you get used to one Bob Dylan, and then the next year you either see him in concert or hear his new album, and he's totally changed his sound and his style. Not so much in later years, but certainly in the 60s, 70s, and largely in the 80s, there were so many different Bob Dylans.
Yeah, it's
But
really astonishing. So, Seth, in terms of your career as a writer, commentator, critic, you've gone from Dylan, um, your book, Bob Dylan, Prophet, Mystic, Poet, to a very different kind of artist. One, in some ways, at least, I think, kind of opposite. George Harrison. Your new book is on Harrison. It's just got a nice review in the Wall Street Journal. It's an Oxford University book, Within You, Without You. Before we get to Harrison, how did you get from Dylan, who you've identified in the most Jewish of ways, to George Harrison, who you can say many things about him, but he doesn't seem to have much of a Moses-like quality? There's nothing very Jewish about George Harrison.
no, not at all. And I mean, as much as the Jewish Dylan became the topic of my book, I I came to that from the point of view of just being a music critic and music journalist in general. Um, in that particular way, I found my way into Dylan in a way that nobody else had done, to the extent that there had been no book written about Dylan from a Jewish lens. So the George Harrison thing was was utterly different. I mean, I didn't need the Jewish thing. In fact, I particularly didn't want to do that because I didn't want to get pigeonholed as, oh, that guy who writes about the Jewish roots of every kind of music. I came to George Harrison simply because I loved him, and you know, since I was a young teenager, I remember having the My Sweet Lord, the 45 single, and having Ringo Starr's It Don't Come Easy 45, which was actually, people don't know this, but it was actually written and produced by George Harrison. And there even exists the demo version of It Don't Come Easy, which you can hear George singing, which he gave to Ringo to say, okay, here's the song, now learn it. But
Yeah, I have to, and I'm sure you have a very good response on this, and I'm sure you saw the Peter Jackson documentary, Get Back, a couple of years ago. I thought, and maybe I'm being a little unfair, I thought it was a very good documentary, but I thought Harrison came out of it looking really paranoid and very unimpressive, certainly compared to McCartney and obviously Lennon and even Ringo Starr. Is that a fair observation of that Jackson documentary? Do you think it treated Harrison unfairly?
I didn't get that impression. I mean, I won't say it's unfair because, everybody sees things differently.
I saw him in the way it was presented, and maybe I'm being unfair, but he seemed a very insecure guy around these two enormously talented figures, very envious of the McCartney-Lennon relationship,
Mhm.
and desperate for more attention. I don't know whether that's fair or not.
Yeah, I don't know that I didn't get the impression that he was desperate for more attention. I, when I think back and I watched the full 8 hours several times, and I write about it extensively in my new book, um, I take away all the scenes where they're all having a great time, where they're all, they're smiling, they're jamming, they're going from one song to another. I think you do see there's obviously tensions in the band amongst all of them. Ringo comes in one morning and somebody says, "Well, how are you?" And he says, "Well, to be honest, I'm not very good." And what he's saying is that he's totally hungover.
Yeah, but that's Ringo for you.
Yeah, yeah. So that's Ringo. And as far as John Lennon goes, I mean, that whole, so the movie takes place over the course of 4 weeks, in case people don't know. The entire first week, John Lennon is, I don't want to slander him, although, he's not around to defend himself, but let's just say for whatever reason, and I have my suspicions why, and I think it's documented, he's totally out of it. I mean, he's there, but he's not there. He's not contributing. He has almost no new songs.
Well, is it the Yoko element too?
That was part of it too, although I don't want to be blaming Yoko,
yeah.
which I don't think is fair either, because certainly that, John bears whatever responsibility there is to bear for Yoko's being in the studio, which was a new thing.
Yeah, I mean, that movie, it certainly didn't it didn't do Yoko Ono any favors. I mean, having watched that, I might have thought that your book might have been called The Third Man, in the sense that he was very much the third man. But of course, you're much more generous, which isn't saying much to me. You've called it Within You, Without You, listening to George Harrison. I know that's a reference to a song. I agree. I mean, obviously, Harrison did some good work, obviously within the Beatles, but also outside the Beatles. But again, in comparison to, I mean, it's impossible to compare anyone with Dylan. But what is Harrison's cultural significance beyond the Beatles? Is there any?
Oh, absolutely. There's huge cultural significance to George Harrison, which I talk about in the book. And that is, you can divide it into a number of ways. I mean, the new music composer Philip Glass basically credits George Harrison with, if not inventing world music, with making the biggest splash in opening Western listeners' ears to sounds from other cultures. And this is obviously the Indian influence in the Beatles' music, starting in the mid '60s and continuing on to the end of the Beatles. But it's not only the music, because through the music, George learned from Ravi Shankar that you can't divorce the music from the culture and from the religion and from the spirituality, which George also dived into. And then that became the subject of many of his songs. When I was in 8th grade, my social studies teacher, we were studying India. That was on the curriculum. And as part of a way to get us engaged and to learn about Hinduism, he brought in All Things Must Pass, George's first solo album, and played a bunch of the songs that dealt specifically with Hindu practices, with chanting the names of the Lord and you'll be free, and the concepts of reincarnation. So, George didn't invent any of this, but George was one of the most famous people in the world. Had the largest platform, along with Lennon and McCartney and Ringo.
How did that work? To prepare for A Complete Unknown, I also rewatched Monterey Pop, which ends with Ravi Shankar with this triumphant performance. And he certainly eclipses Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, The Who, all the other figures who were performed at Monterey. How did Harrison's influence play out in terms of Ravi Shankar becoming this global star by the end of the 60s?
Sure. Well, I'm just pausing because I'm trying to figure out, we're talking about the 60s, but it was really in the 70s where George Harrison fully collaborated with Ravi Shankar on a number of projects, which really brought Ravi Shankar to the biggest audience. And, the first one was the concert for Bangladesh,
Mm.
when, Ravi Shankar went to George Harrison and said, I want to do this concert to raise money for humanitarian aid to Bangladesh. And I hope to raise about $20,000 so we can, feed some people. And George smiled and said, okay, I'll help you. And of course, that became the incredible concert for Bangladesh, which was really the first superstar humanitarian benefit concert where you leverage celebrity for a good cause. There were lesser efforts, but on the level of two Beatles, Bob Dylan, Leon Russell, who was huge at the time, Eric Clapton to some extent. He was there.
So you
That's
get
about
from
it.
Harrison to Bob Geldof. Um,
Exactly. So, he invented that whole thing. And then when it came time for him to go on tour in 1974, his idea of a tour was it was going to be Ravi Shankar and George Harrison. Now, the promoter of the tour said, if you want me to promote this tour, it's got to be George Harrison with Ravi Shankar. But he brought Shankar and his huge ensemble with him to all 45 concert dates in North America. And the first 40 minutes of the concert each time was a Ravi Shankar concert before they all played together. So this also brought
what about
through
his
the
contribution? I take your point on that. What about his contribution to the Beatles? What's your analysis? I mean, had Harrison not been chosen, they found somebody else, would the Beatles still have been the Beatles? Was it really essentially Lennon and McCartney?
No, absolutely not. Lennon and McCartney as a songwriting duo were certainly the greatest songwriting duo of the latter half of the 20th century, if not the entire 20th century. There's no taking that away from them. But they were songwriters and singers. And the Beatles were a band. And the particular characteristics of George Harrison as a guitar player, essentially, and Ringo's unique style of drumming, putting all those elements together is what made the Beatles. And you take any one of those out, and they're not the Beatles, and they're not as hugely creative and popular as they become. And George's, the sound of the Beatles, what we think of as their sound, is they were a guitar band, and George was the lead guitarist, and all of those clever intros and the instrumental interludes and the hooks and the riffs that are so memorable. George composed almost all of these and played almost all of these to the extent that he was almost a co-composer of the songs. Now, I'm not claiming that, he should have gotten songwriting credits, because I don't think that's necessarily the case, and it doesn't matter. It's not that interesting to me. But the fact is that he did supply all that. And when you you go back and listen to the Beatles, you hear, and when you really listen to what you're hearing, what is making up this music, George's guitar is the skeleton running through all of the recordings. So Lennon and McCartney are the songwriters, but they bring the song to the band, which includes all four of them, and George Martin, who really was the fifth Beatle in terms of creating the records, creating the sound. And that's when it becomes a record, and that's when it becomes a hit record, and a hit record flavored very much by the sound of George Harrison's guitar, which
How
was
good
not the
a
same.
guitarist was he? I mean, he had this very odd relationship with Eric Clapton, didn't he?
Yeah. He and Eric Clapton were, although they were friends, they were entirely different in their approach to the guitar. Clapton was utterly blues based and was a master of improvisation. George was certainly knew the blues, but he also had a vast background in all kinds of 20th century popular music, as did all the Beatles.
Yeah, I mean that one of the things that the Jackson documentary brought out, I thought, was McCartney's education in that.
Right,
Less
right.
less Harrison. I mean, as I said, I didn't think he was. But maybe I didn't look at all the material. But didn't seem as kind to Harrison as he was to McCartney.
Hmm. You know, they all had frustrations at that time,
Yeah,
and George had frustrations going on at that exact
I
time
mean, his
in his
private life was
in
odd,
his
wasn't
private.
it, as well?
Yes, exactly. So that I think impacted. So that after the first week when he says, I'm leaving, and he was leaving to go home to save his marriage, really, and immediately over the next couple of days, all the Beatles got together several times, hashed things out. Everybody got their say, what things, how can we make this work? And it was kind of crazy that first week. There was no direction. Nobody knew what they were doing there. Were they making a movie? Were they making a record? Were they rehearsing for a tour? All those things were bandied about, but it wasn't clear, and there was no producer for
Yeah.
whatever reason.
I mean, the thing that, and I don't want to keep on harping on this. I think from the movie, at least, Lennon comes out with so much humor, and Harrison. There was nothing very funny about Harrison. Didn't seem to have much of a sense of humor. But what about his early death? I mean, if he was still around as an elder statesman like Paul McCartney or Ringo Starr, do you think we might remember George Harrison differently?
I don't think so. I don't think so. Based on the last 10 years of his life. So that what basically comes after Cloud Nine with the huge hit, I've Got My Mind Set on You, and after the Traveling Wilburys, his band with Bob Dylan. Um, he, I mean, he was always reluctant, certainly to perform live. He was one of the main people in 1966 who said, "Okay, I'm done. We're not going to do this anymore." Because it was crazy, because Beatlemania was insane and dangerous, and George was very sensitive to the danger, and he was something of a prescient about that, because he saw the violence that was the ugly other side of Beatlemania, and that eventually found its way out in the assassination of John Lennon, and at the end of the 90s,
Right, and
in the
resulted
near
in from
assa-
Monterey to Altamont.
and then George himself getting, almost murdered in his own home in England in I think it was in 1999, just, a year and a half before he died, when he
So
was
let's
stabbed.
end. You've written these two books, one on Dylan and one on George Harrison, this latest book, Within You, Without You. As I said, there's this debate going on about why we're not getting great culture, why young
Mm.
people aren't making original music, why there's no appetite for original music. What should Dylan and Harrison teach us about cultural renewal, whether it's in
Mm.
the form of song or video games or Instagram posts or whatever else it is, art, literature? What brings Harrison and Dylan together in terms of reinvigorating our culture, of making us think more creatively and perhaps originally about ourselves?
Well, it's a great question, and I think, it's one that we could also apply to any other number of hugely original, creative artists, in the broadest sense of the term, artists, creative people. And so I don't know that the lesson is any more deep than what, Dylan sang. He not busy being born is busy dying. And
Mm,
I think, you need to keep being born in your creativity. You need to keep pushing the edges. And I think, anybody listening to this, think of your favorite either musician or painter or author, and And the great ones are always doing that, are always reinventing themselves,
Are the
are
great ones
always
always forever young? Forever young? Is that the key, sir?
that's a great way of putting it. I hadn't thought on those terms, but yes, I guess in a sense, if youth implies originality, which it often is, because often these people's best work is in their 20s. Um, so yes, it is forever young.
And I asked Taplin this, and he came up with a couple of artists. Have you heard anything recently that's really blown you away by young artists, musically or otherwise?
You know, I try to keep up a little bit. I'm not, I'm not immersed in it. And I have to say that, there's been a few things I've heard here and there, but nothing that I'm hugely excited about that I want to run out and see it, or I'm waiting for, I mean, Billie Eilish is interesting, and I like some of her sounds. Am I dying for her next album to come out? Not particularly, but that's just me. And I'm old, and this is not music being made for me.
Well, Seth Rogovoy, you may be old, but you're not decrepit. Important contribution. I couldn't agree more with you about your excellent review of the new Dylan film, and I think your important new book on Harrison should be read by all Beatles fans and non-Beatles fans. Within You, Without You. Happy New Year, Seth, and we'll get you back on the show to talk more art, movies, and music. Thank you so much.